At precisely 9:17 a.m. on a Tuesday, Walter Jenkins set aside his mop and entered Pinnacle Technology's executive boardroom unannounced. Laughter erupted as the all-white leadership team spotted the 65-year-old black janitor in their sacred
"Space. Lost your way, old man," Michael Pinnacle sneered, his Stanford MBA and family name a shield for his questionable business practices. "Not at all," Walter replied, sliding a document across the polished mahogany table. The laughter died as they read the official proof that this invisible man they'd degraded for decades was actually the majority shareholder. While they'd seen only a janitor, Walter had been watching, documenting, and waiting for this perfect moment. His engineering degree from Howard University had gathered dust, but his ownership papers hadn't. Now, as 200 employees faced layoffs, Walter Jenkins would finally reclaim his company from those who never bothered to see the man behind the mop. The hallways of Pinnacle Technologies gleamed under the fluorescent lights as Walter Jenkins pushed his cleaning cart through the empty corridors at 5:30 a.m. His weathered hands gripped the handle with practiced ease, the calluses telling stories of decades of hard work. At 65, his movements were slower than they once were, but no less precise. The company wouldn't officially come to life for another 2 hours, but Walter preferred the quiet of dawn. It gave him time to think, to observe, to remember. He paused outside the executive suites, fishing out his ring of keys. The polished brass nameplate on the nearest door read, "Michael Pinnacle, CEO." Walter allowed himself a slight smile as he unlocked the door and slipped inside. The office was immaculate, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a breathtaking view of the city skyline. Walter emptied the trash can, careful not to disturb the meticulously arranged papers on the mahogany desk. As he worked, his eyes drifted to a framed photograph on the wall, a much younger Michael standing beside his father, Jonathan Pinnacle, both men beaming with pride at the ribbon-cutting ceremony for Pinnacle Tech's first headquarters. What the photograph didn't show was the third person who had been standing just out of frame that day. Walter dusted the frame with particular care, his reflection ghosting over the glass surface. He remembered that day well, the day Jonathan had promised him the world. The day before everything changed. The sound of approaching footsteps pulled Walter from his reverie. He quickly gathered his supplies and headed for the door, nearly colliding with Rebecca Wilson, the company's HR director, who was arriving unusually early. "Oh!" Rebecca startled, her hand flying to her chest. When she registered who stood before her, her surprise morphed into dismissive recognition. "It's just you, Walter." "Morning, Ms. Wilson," Walter replied, his voice gentle but dignified. "Sorry to startle you." Rebecca barely acknowledged the apology, her attention already fixed on her phone. "While you're here, the executive bathroom needs attention. Someone complained about water spots on the mirrors yesterday." She wrinkled her nose slightly. "And make sure you use the proper cleaning supplies this time. The smell was off last week." Walter nodded, swallowing the response that rose to his throat. "Yes, ma'am." "Good," Rebecca said, already walking past him into her office. She paused at the doorway. "And Walter, the cleaning closet on the 3rd floor still smells like you've been eating your lunch in there. The executives have commented on it. Find somewhere else, please." The door closed behind her, and Walter stood alone in the hallway, his expression unchanged, save for a slight tightening around his eyes. The 3rd floor closet was indeed where he took his lunch breaks, the only space in the building where he could sit in private for 30 minutes. The building had a cafeteria, of course, but the last time Walter had tried to eat there, Michael Pinnacle himself had made a comment about keeping the help separate from the talent. Walter pushed his cart toward the executive bathroom, his shoulders straight, despite the weight they carried. 20 minutes later, he was polishing the last mirror when the bathroom door swung open and two young executives walked in, deep in conversation. "I'm telling you, Brad, the old man has lost his touch," the taller of the two was saying. "Last quarter's numbers were abysmal, and now he's talking about cutting another 10% of the workforce." "Lower-level employees only, I assume," Brad replied, straightening his tie in the mirror Walter had just cleaned, seemingly oblivious to the janitor's presence. "Naturally," the first man laughed. He finally noticed Walter and lowered his voice slightly, though not enough. "Speaking of which, how old do you think this one is? Shouldn't there be an age limit on pushing a mop?" Brad snickered, glancing at Walter's reflection. "Maybe he can't afford to retire. Or maybe he just loves the smell of bleach and cleaning up after us." He raised his voice. "Isn't that right, old-timer?" Walter kept his eyes down, focusing on wringing out his cloth in the sink. "Bathroom's all clean, gentlemen," he said quietly, gathering his supplies. "Thank God for small mercies," the first executive muttered. "At least they still know how to follow orders." As Walter moved toward the door, Brad stepped slightly into his path, forcing Walter to sidestep around him. "Hey, while you're at it, someone spilled coffee in the conference room. Be a good boy and take care of that, would you?" The condescension in the young man's voice was unmistakable, the boy sliding from his lips with practiced ease despite Walter being old enough to be his grandfather. "Yes, sir," Walter replied, his voice steady even as something hardened in his chest. "Right away." Throughout the morning, similar interactions played out across the building. A female executive held her nose dramatically as he passed, whispering loudly to her colleague about that smell. Two managers abruptly stopped their conversation when Walter entered their office to vacuum, watching him with suspicious eyes as if he might steal something if not closely monitored. By lunchtime, Walter retreated to his small sanctuary, the third-floor cleaning closet that Rebecca had complained about. He pulled a small folding stool from behind the shelves of supplies and sat down heavily, his knees creaking in protest. From a worn leather lunch bag, he extracted a simple sandwich and a thermos of coffee. As he ate in the dim light of the closet, surrounded by the smell of industrial cleaners, his mind drifted back to a different time. He'd been young then, barely 30, working as a janitor for a much smaller company, the fledgling startup that Jonathan Pinnacle had built from nothing. Jonathan had been different from his son. He'd known Walter's name, asked about his family, treated him like a human being. There had been that night, the night the company nearly collapsed. Walter had been working late, emptying trash cans, while Jonathan sat alone in his office, head in his hands, surrounded by bills and final notices. Walter had brought him a cup of coffee, and somehow they'd started talking. Walter had mentioned the savings he'd scraped together over the years, planning to open his own small business someday. "You know what, Walter?" Jonathan had said, eyes suddenly alight with an idea. "I'd rather have one honest partner than 10 wealthy sharks." The memory dissolved as the closet door suddenly opened, flooding the small space with harsh fluorescent light. Michael Pinnacle stood in the doorway, his expensive suit a stark contrast to the utilitarian setting. "So this is where you hide," Michael said, his nose wrinkling at the smell. "Did Rebecca not speak to you about this? We've had complaints." Walter quickly stood, tucking away the remains of his meal. "Sorry, Mr. Pinnacle, I was just finishing." Michael's eyes narrowed as he took in the small stool, the lunch bag. Is this some kind of living arrangement I should know about? Because I'm pretty sure that would violate about a dozen health codes. "No, sir," Walter replied, feeling a flush of embarrassment despite himself. "Just my lunch break." "Well, take it elsewhere," Michael said dismissively. "Preferably outside the building. This isn't a homeless shelter." His eyes flicked over Walter's worn uniform. "Though I can see how you might be confused about that." Before Walter could respond, Michael's attention shifted to his phone, which had begun to ring. "I need to take this. Make sure this closet is emptied of your personal effects by the end of the day." He walked away without waiting for a response, already engaged in his call. Walter stood in the closet doorway for a long moment, a familiar anger burning low in his chest. Slowly, deliberately, he packed away his lunch and folded the stool, placing it in his cart. But instead of continuing his rounds, he wheeled the cart to the employee locker room in the basement. The room was deserted at this hour. Walter approached. His locker, an old dented metal box in the far corner. He spun the combination lock with practiced fingers and opened the door. Inside, hanging neatly, was a spare uniform. Below it sat a battered leather briefcase that looked out of place among the humble surroundings. Walter carefully removed the briefcase and placed it on the nearby bench. The brass latches had long since lost their shine, but they opened smoothly at his touch. Inside lay a collection of documents protected by plastic sleeves, share certificates, contracts, letters, all meticulously preserved over decades. His fingers traced over one document in particular, a share certificate made out in his name, representing 51% ownership of Pinnacle Technologies, signed by Jonathan Pinnacle himself. Next to it lay a handwritten letter, the paper yellowed with age, but the words still clear. "Walter, my friend, without your belief in me and your investment, there would be no Pinnacle Tech. I know you want to remain in the background for now, and I'll respect that wish. But never forget, this company is as much yours as it is mine. When the time comes, these shares will speak for you." The time had never seemed right to reveal the truth. First, it was out of respect for Jonathan and his vision. Then, after Jonathan's unexpected death 15 years ago, it was the shock of watching Michael take control and systematically dismantle his father's legacy. By the time Walter realized what was happening, Michael had established himself so thoroughly that challenging him seemed impossible. But today something had shifted. Perhaps it was the accumulation of small indignities. Perhaps it was overhearing the executives discussing another round of layoffs that would devastate the lower-level employees who had given years to the company. Or perhaps it was simply that, at 65, Walter had finally run out of reasons to wait. He carefully returned the documents to the briefcase, closed it, and placed it back in his locker. Not today. But soon. The reckoning that had been decades in the making was finally approaching. As Walter resumed his afternoon cleaning duties, he paused outside the main conference room, where he could hear raised voices discussing the company's future, his company's future. His expression remained impassive, but his eyes held a determination that had been dormant for too long. The time for waiting was over. 3 days later, Pinnacle Technologies was abuzz with tension as key personnel hurried toward the main conference room. An emergency board meeting had been called, the email marked urgent landing in executive inboxes just that morning. The subject line, strategic restructuring and asset management, was corporate speak for what everyone feared, massive layoffs and selling off company divisions. Walter stood quietly in the corridor outside the conference room, wiping down the glass display case that housed the company's awards and accolades. Through the reflection, he watched board members file in, men and women in expensive suits, their faces set in expressions of grave importance. None of them so much as glanced his way. Michael Pinnacle was the last to arrive, flanked by his CFO, David Price, and his loyal right-hand man, Jason Matthews. Michael's stride was confident, almost arrogant, as he swept past Walter without acknowledgement. "Is everyone here?" Michael's voice carried through the still open door. "Close that, will you?" he directed at his assistant, pointing to the door. "We don't need the maintenance staff eavesdropping on company business." The door closed with a soft click, but not before Walter caught the dismissive wave of Michael's hand in his direction. Walter continued polishing the display case, his movements deliberate, as he positioned himself near the air vent, a spot he knew from experience carried sound from the conference room into the hallway. Inside, Michael stood at the head of the long mahogany table, surveying the gathered board members with the practiced confidence of a man who believed himself untouchable. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," Michael began, his voice carrying clearly through the vent. "As you know, our last quarter was challenging. Our profit margins have shrunk to unacceptable levels, and shareholders are demanding action." David Price, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses, distributed folders to everyone present. "The numbers don't lie," he said, his voice thin and reedy. "We're looking at a 15% drop in revenue compared to last year's projections. Which is why," Michael continued, "I've assembled a comprehensive restructuring plan." He tapped his folder for emphasis. "Page 3 outlines the first phase, a strategic workforce reduction of 20% across all departments." A murmur of concern rippled through the room. 20%? Questioned Eleanor Donovan, one of the longest-serving board members. "That's nearly 200 employees, Michael." 187 to be precise, David interjected. "Primarily from lower and mid-level positions, where redundancies can be eliminated without impacting core operations." Outside, Walter's hand stilled on the glass. 187 people. People with families, mortgages, dreams. People who had given years, sometimes decades, to Pinnacle Tech, his company. Back inside, Michael was already moving on. Phase 2 involves liquidating underperforming assets. The Research and Development Division hasn't produced a marketable innovation in 18 months. We'll retain a skeleton crew for appearance's sake, but essentially we're shutting it down. But R&D was your father's pride and joy, Eleanor protested. Jonathan believed innovation was the heart of Pinnacle Tech. Michael's laugh was short and devoid of humor. My father also believed in paying the janitor more than market rate because he seemed like a good soul. Sentimentality doesn't keep shareholders happy, Eleanor. Laughter rippled around the table at Michael's comment. Jason Matthews leaned forward, his expression serious despite the laughter. We've also identified some irregular accounting practices that need addressing. David has been working with me to clean things up. David shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Yes, well, there have been some creative bookkeeping measures implemented over the years. Nothing illegal, of course, he added hastily. But perhaps not entirely transparent to shareholders. The point is, Michael cut in, these changes need to happen immediately. The first round of terminations begins next week, followed by the asset liquidation. I've already spoken with our PR team about managing the optics. From his position by the air vent, Walter could hear every word. His hands, which had maintained their steady rhythm on the display glass, finally stilled completely. This wasn't just a cost-cutting measure. This was the systematic dismantling of everything Jonathan Pinnacle had built, everything Walter had helped build. Inside the conference room, the discussion continued, with board members raising concerns only to have Michael smoothly dismissed them. The conversation shifted to logistics. Who would handle the terminations? How severance would be structured? Which assets would be sold first? The cleaning staff can be reduced by half, Michael was saying. We contract with an outside service for the heavy work, cheaper, and we won't have to worry about benefits. Speaking of which, David interjected, there's the old janitor, Jenkins, I think. He's well past retirement age but still on full benefits. That alone could save us. Daddy's old charity case, Michael interrupted with a dismissive wave. I've been meaning to phase him out for years. Consider it done. Walter set down his cleaning cloth and walked deliberately toward the basement. It was time. At precisely 9:17 a.m. the next day, Walter knew the board would reconvene to finalize the details of their strategic restructuring. He made his way to the conference room floor, briefcase in hand, his heart pounding but his resolve unwavering. Outside the conference room, Michael's assistant looked up in surprise as Walter approached, clearly not recognizing him at first without his uniform. "Sir, can I help you?" she asked, her confusion evident. "The board is in a private meeting right now." "I know," Walter replied simply. "They're expecting me." Before she could protest, Walter stepped past her and opened the conference room door. The conversation inside abruptly halted as all heads turned toward the interruption. Michael Pinnacle, mid-sentence, stared in confusion. "What the—" Recognition dawned on his face, followed quickly by annoyance. "Jenkins? What are you doing, and why are you dressed like that?" The room erupted in snickers and confused murmurs. "Is that the janitor?" Someone whispered loudly. "What's he wearing? Is that suit from the 90s? Another board member remarked, prompting more laughter. Jason Matthews rose from his seat, moving toward Walter with a threatening posture. "This is a closed meeting. You need to leave immediately." Walter stood his ground, his dignity intact despite the mockery. "I'm afraid I can't do that, Mr. Matthews. You see, I have something important to contribute to this discussion about the future of Pinnacle Technologies." Michael's face contorted with a mixture of disbelief and amusement. "You? Contribute?" He laughed, looking around the table to ensure. Others joined in. "Look, Jenkins, I don't know what you think you overheard, but this is a board meeting, not a janitorial review. If you're worried about your job, take it up with HR after we're done here." The laughter grew louder, more confident. One executive mimicked pushing a mop, while another made a crude joke about Walter being lost on his way to the custodial closet. "Is this some kind of protest?" David Price asked nervously. Because security can be here in 30 seconds. Through it all, Walter remained calm, even as the color of his skin became the subject of more than one whispered joke at the table. He placed his briefcase on the conference table with deliberate precision. "Gentlemen, ladies," Walter said, his voice quiet but firm, cutting through the laughter. "I'm not here as a janitor today. I'm here as the majority shareholder of Pinnacle Technologies." The laughter died abruptly, replaced by confused silence. Michael recovered first, his face reddening with anger. "That's absurd. This little stunt will cost you your job. Jason, call security." "Before you do that," Walter replied, opening his briefcase to reveal the neatly organized documents within. "I suggest you take a look at these." He removed the share certificate, the original, not a copy, and placed it in the center of the table for all to see. The Pinnacle Tech logo at the top was an earlier version, and Jonathan Pinnacle's signature at the bottom was unmistakable. "What is this supposed to be?" Michael demanded, though his voice had lost some of its confidence. "This," Walter said calmly, "is the certificate for 51% ownership of Pinnacle Technologies, issued to me by your father 30 years ago. I've been content to remain silent all these years out of respect for Jonathan and his vision. But after what I heard yesterday, after seeing how far this company has strayed from its founding principles, that silence ends today." The room had fallen completely still, every eye fixed on the document before them, and the quiet, dignified man who had brought their world to a sudden, unexpected halt. "This is ridiculous," Michael finally said, his voice tight with anger. "You can't seriously expect us to believe that my father secretly gave majority ownership of his company to the janitor." The way he emphasized janitor made it clear what he really wanted to say. Several executives shifted uncomfortably, darting glances between Michael and Walter, who remained standing calmly at the end of the table. "Not secretly, Mr. Pinnacle," Walter replied evenly. "The transaction was properly registered with the SEC. The documentation has been maintained in trust all these years." He placed several more papers beside the share certificate. "Here are the original transfer documents, the trust agreement, and the registration records." Eleanor Donovan, the longest-serving board member, hesitantly reached for the nearest document. "This appears authentic," she said, her voice carrying a note of wonder. "But why? Why would Jonathan do this? And why wait 30 years to mention it?" "Conveniently, after Jonathan is dead and can't confirm or deny any of this," Jason added accusingly. Walter removed a faded photograph from his briefcase and placed it on the table. It showed 3 men at Pinnacle Tech's first ribbon-cutting ceremony, Jonathan in the middle, flanked by a younger Michael and a younger Walter. It was the same image that hung in Michael's office, except that version had been cropped to remove Walter from the frame. "I met Jonathan Pinnacle in 1993, Walter explained. "I was working nights at Wilson's machine shop, where Jonathan came to prototype his first product designs. I had a degree in electrical engineering from Howard University, but in those days, companies weren't exactly lining up to hire black engineers." The implication hung in the air. "Jonathan and I got to talking about his ideas. I made some suggestions that helped solve a design flaw he'd been struggling with. Thomas had been rejected by every bank in the city, not because his idea wasn't sound, but because he lacked collateral. When he mentioned giving up, I offered him my savings, $50,000. I'd been putting aside, hoping to start my own business someday. $50,000 isn't exactly a controlling stake in a multi-million-dollar corporation, Jason interjected dismissively. It was in 1993, Eleanor countered quietly. Jonathan was operating on a shoestring budget. $50,000 would have been a lifeline. Jonathan insisted on making me a true partner, Walter said. He said anyone who believed in him enough to risk everything deserved an equal stake in the outcome. But that still doesn't explain why you've been working as a janitor all these years, Richard Evans, head of sales, said skeptically. If you owned half the company, why weren't you in the executive suite? A sad smile crossed Walter's face. America in 1993 wasn't ready for a technology company co-founded by a black man. We both knew that investors would shy away, partners would hesitate, doors would close. So we agreed that Jonathan would be the public face of Pinnacle Tech, while I would remain in the background as the janitor. Michael scoffed. That's quite a background position. I needed a job at the company, a way to stay connected, to watch over my investment. Jonathan suggested maintenance because it would allow me access to every part of the building without drawing attention. Walter's eyes swept the room. You'd be surprised what people say when they think no one important is listening. Several executives looked uncomfortable, recalling things they'd said in Walter's presence over the years. When Jonathan died, Walter continued, I considered stepping forward, but you were his son, and I wanted to give you the chance to continue his legacy. I kept hoping you would grow into the kind of leader he believed you could be. The disappointment in his voice was palpable. Instead, I've watched you systematically dismantle everything your father built. The culture of innovation, the respect for every employee, the commitment to integrity. Michael slammed his hand on the table. This is absurd. You're trying to tell us my father secretly gave control of his company to the black janitor, and you both decided to keep it hidden for decades. Do you realize how insane that sounds? Watch your tone, Michael, Eleanor warned softly. My tone? Michael laughed, incredulously. We're in the middle of a major restructuring, and this person walks in with some ancient paperwork and a far-fetched story, and you're concerned about my tone? David Price, the CFO, had been examining the financial documents with growing concern. These appear legitimate, he admitted reluctantly. The signatures match our records, and the trust arrangement explains why these holdings never appeared in our standard reports. Even if these documents were valid at some point, Michael argued, surely they've been superseded by one of our many corporate reorganizations over the years. Walter shook his head. Each time the company restructured, the trust's holdings were preserved. Your own financial department processed the paperwork, though I doubt anyone questioned why a notation about original trust holdings remained present through every iteration. David's face paled. The WJ designation, I always assumed it was some legacy account from the founding days. It was, Walter confirmed quietly. Mine. The boardroom erupted in overlapping conversations. Through it all, Michael's face grew increasingly flushed with anger and humiliation. Enough! Michael finally shouted. Even if these documents are somehow legitimate, you can't just walk in here and start giving orders. There are procedures, protocols. That's correct, Walter acknowledged. As majority shareholder, I can't directly manage day-to-day operations without board approval. but I can call for votes on major company decisions." He paused. "So let's start with a simple 1. I move to cancel the planned layoffs and asset liquidation discussed yesterday." "Seconded," Eleanor said immediately. Michael stared at her in disbelief. "Eleanor, you can't be serious." "Only someone deeply connected to this company would wait decades to step forward," Eleanor replied. "Only someone with profound respect for Jonathan's legacy would give his son so many chances." She turned to Walter. "But why now, after all these years? Why today?" "Because yesterday I heard you discussing the termination of nearly 200 employees, people with families, mortgages, dreams, people who have given years to this company, and I heard how casually that decision was made, as if their livelihoods were just numbers on a spreadsheet." His voice remained measured, but there was steel beneath it. "That's not the company Jonathan and I built." Eleanor called for a vote. One by one, hands rose in support of Walter's motion. Only Michael, Jason, and 2 others kept their hands down. "This isn't over, Jenkins," Michael hissed, standing up so abruptly his chair toppled backward. "My legal team will tear these documents apart." "They're welcome to try," Walter replied calmly. "In the meantime, I believe you'll find your executive access has been revoked. You're suspended pending investigation into financial irregularities that have come to my attention." Michael stared at him, speechless with rage, before storming out of the room, Jason following close behind. In the silence that followed, Eleanor moved to Walter's side. "Well, Mr. Jenkins, or should I say, Mr. Chairman, what happens now?" Walter looked around at the stunned faces of the board members, some hostile, some curious, a few even relieved. "Now," he said quietly, "we rebuild." 1 year later, Walter Jenkins stood at a podium in the newly renovated atrium of Pinnacle Technologies. Behind him, a banner proclaimed, "Celebrating innovation, integrity, and inclusion." The company had transformed. After the initial shock and legal challenges, all of which had failed, Walter had implemented sweeping changes. The planned layoffs had been canceled. The R&D department had been expanded, resulting in 2 breakthrough products that had revitalized the company's market position. Most importantly, a new corporate culture had taken root. One where every employee, regardless of position, was treated with dignity and respect. Where innovation was encouraged at all levels. Where the maintenance staff received the same benefits and opportunities as the executives. 1 year ago, Walter addressed the gathered employees, I walked into a boardroom where I'd previously only emptied trash cans, and I reclaimed my place as the owner of this company. Many doubted whether a janitor, particularly an old black janitor, could successfully lead a company of this size. He gestured to the screen behind him, where the company's latest financial results were displayed. The numbers speak for themselves. Revenue up 15%. Employee retention at record highs. A product pipeline stronger than at any point in our history. Walter paused, looking out at the faces before him. Faces that now registered respect rather than dismissal when they saw him. But the most important change can't be measured in dollars or stock prices. It's in how we see each other, not as job titles or functions, but as human beings with value, with dignity, with ideas worth hearing. He motioned toward a group of maintenance workers standing together at the back of the room. Every person in this room contributes to our success. Every person deserves to be seen. As the applause swelled around him, Walter glanced at the wall where a new installation had been mounted. his old janitor's uniform, carefully preserved in a glass case. Beside it, a simple plaque read, "The most powerful voices often belong to those we fail to hear." In the crowd, a young custodian listened intently, her eyes bright with possibility. Walter caught her gaze and nodded slightly. The message was clear.